This is Antic, the Atari 8-Bit Podcast. I'm Kevin Savitz. Robert Anschuetz, Eric Anschuetz, and John Weisgberber are childhood friends who published 3 games in Antic magazine. Kooky's Quest was published in the February 1985 issue, Overflow in July 1985, and Robot Dungeon was the disc bonus in the November 1985 issue. They also wrote several other games in Atari BASIC, some of which they submitted to Compute and Analog Computing magazines that went unpublished. Fast forward to August 2017, when the 3 posted on the AtariAge forum. We are now releasing all of these games into the public domain. These are not new games, but they are new to the Atari 8-bit community. Many of these games really pushed the envelope at that time for what could be done in Atari BASIC, including bi-directional smooth scrolling, assembly language, subroutines, parallax scrolling, cutscenes, attract modes, display list tricks, interleaved displays, etc. In addition to releasing their games, some for the first time, the group wrote a new article describing how they got together as a team to write these programs along with game instructions and development notes. I wanted to find out more, so we got together for a 4-way interview over Skype. Check the show notes at ataripodcast.com for links to the games that they created and their new article about them. This interview took place on August 4th, 2017. Let's start with, just for fun, how you guys met. I assume since you're twins that you, Robert and Eric, you met at a very early age.
Met in the womb.
Nice.
Before we were born. So we all grew up in a small town, Ypsilanti, Michigan. And Eric and I, of course, have known each other forever. But John went to our same elementary school, and we actually met in first grade. I can't recall if he was actually in one of our classes, but...
Right. We used to walk back and forth to school. And our houses were a couple of blocks apart, so I suspect we might have met walking back and forth from school.
Probably.
Excellent. All right. So how did computers enter your lives? Was Atari your first machines, or was there computers at the school? Kind of set me up with that.
No computers at the school because I guess there was. I guess there was a TRS-80 in the physics lab at school before we got our Ataris, but we really never touched it. We never used that computer at school. And, I think it was, absolutely the Atari 400 was Eric and I's first computer that we received for Christmas in 1981. And John, since he was over at our house pretty much every day, he was introduced probably that very day as well.
That's true. Yeah, those guys pulled me in, and the only thing I can think of before that was maybe like a console system, potentially.
Right. We all had those breakout systems. Sears made a system that played video pinball and breakout and probably Pong or something all rolled into one. We had that system. Both of us had that system. Robert and I had the first cartridge system ever, the Fairchild Channel F, which goes way back.
Yeah.
And we had that a few years before that. But we always liked video games, and we just wanted to see if we could program them.
Yeah, so we were pushing our parents in that Christmas of 1981 to get a computer, obviously, and in preparation for that. And that was in high school. We were probably in 10th grade in high school at that point. And John and Eric and I all had read creative computing in our school library. So we were prepared for it. We had a friend that had an Apple II, and we were kind of looking at all the different computers, looking at, I think it boiled down to either an Apple II, an Atari, or a TRS-80 color computer. And I think we picked the right one, obviously.
I think you chose wisely, yes.
Yeah, the Atari was so much cheaper than the Apple II. The Apple II had a lot more software, but I think what really grabbed us is that looking at the ads in creative computing and seeing Atari's ad that showed like Missile Command and asteroids and all those kinds of things grabbed us in the magazine. And I think there was a computer store that was near a mall called Arborland in Ann Arbor, and I think we probably saw the Atari before we bought one, but I'm not even I'm not even positive about that. I don't even know if we saw one actually before we got it for Christmas.
John, did you have a computer, or were you one of those people who were just like leeching off your friends who had the cool machine?
I was initially, yeah, but it was not long after they got theirs that I worked on my parents, and eventually I got my own Atari 400.
Nice.
I spent a lot of time typing on that membrane keyboard, even into college.
Wow.
So,
wow.
Yeah.
So,
Yep.
so you published all these games, which we'll get to for the magazines, but you guys wrote, you coded and typed and all these on the 400 keyboard, huh?
Yeah.
Almost all of them.
Wow.
Some of the later ones, Sakoban and Yahtzee, were probably done on an 800 XL. Robert and I got an 800 XL towards the very end, but everything else was done on an Atari 400.
And most of that was with the just 410 cassette drive too. For most of those games were probably written just with a cassette tape backup.
Wow.
Even one game that was published by Antic, we can get to that later, but it was called Robot Dungeon, and it was on their disc edition, ironically. But I remember when we wrote it, we didn't even have a disc drive. We wrote it assuming it would work on a disc drive, and we weren't even positive. That was, it was kind of ironic that it showed up on their disc special bonus disc edition when we didn't even write it with a disc drive.
Nice. Okay, so you guys, your kids, you got your 400s. I assume, start to teach yourself BASIC, typing in things out of the magazines. Do you remember at what point you were just like, let's write a game? And at what point did it become, let's try to get this published in a magazine?
Well, I think it started when we used to type in the games from the magazines. And I would say that was inspirational. And Eric and Robert always seemed to be into learning about what you could do with the hardware, and actually, taught me a lot of the tricks, display lists and graphics modes and things like that. And so I think that's where it came from, from typing in games that other people had written.
It was probably within a year of typing in a lot of those games that we had started writing games that were beyond the basics. We had done a few early games. Robert did a game, there was a ripoff of the game Phoenix, just the screen where the large bird is flying around and you had to shoot its wings off or whatever. And I remember that was probably the first game that any of us wrote, and Robert wrote that one probably within a month or two of getting our Atari computer. But really, until you start getting into redefinable characters and different graphics modes, you really don't have a real commercially viable game. And that took us probably 6 months to a year before we really learned all those techniques.
Wow.
Yeah, we probably had a couple of what I would call kind of throwaway games that kind of were playable, but not really with scoring or anything like that. And I remember our first real breakthrough was when I think we saw how to redefine characters from a basic code listing. And we used those. There was no shame in kind of stealing bits of code back then. If you saw an example in a magazine, you just grabbed those lines and used it in your own program. So that's what we did. And we used those same lines in like almost every computer program we ever wrote. But once we figured out how to redefine characters, I remember quickly, and Eric and I were talking about this over the last couple of days, how quickly we put together a game that took place in a pyramid that was actually a two-player game, and you raced to the top of the pyramid while avoiding moving characters in that pyramid. So the pyramid was made out of bricks that we had redefined, redefined the A character to be a brick, and we had snakes and bats and everything else in that pyramid that looked really good. But unfortunately, that's one of those games that was saved on a cassette, and we don't have it. We didn't back it up about 20 years ago when we got the SIO2 PC cable and backed up most of our games. That didn't come with it. So I assume that at that point, that game never even made it to our 1050 floppy disk, as a matter of fact. So I don't think we were able to restore that off a cassette after a while. So that game's lost in memory. And there were a couple other ones that were kind of learning experiences. We had a racing game, and we had a game that was like the game Space Encounters at the arcade. and then we started tackling this game that eventually was published by Antic called Cookie's Quest. But John Weisgberber actually went and found some of our old submittal letters, and he Xeroxed copies of those, and just was looking at them the last couple of days, and also some notes that we were taking while developing the game. We just now realized that the game wasn't always called Cookie's Quest; it was called Dungeon Quest for most of its life. But anyway, I'll let someone else talk.
Why did it get renamed? Was that at the magazine's behest, or did you choose to
Okay, well, I can fill in the story for that. So kind of out of order, after we had developed this game called Dungeon Quest, we really came across a more advanced game called Kooky Climber. And it was a ripoff of Crazy Climber.
Oh.
And so we called it Kooky Climber just to avoid any copyright issues in our naive 18-year-old or 17-year-old minds. So we called it Kooky Climber. And that was actually sold and published. Oh, that was not published, but it was sold to Antic.
No, it was sold to Compute.
Oh, to Compute, that's right. It was sold to Compute. And after we developed that game, we decided to kind of use that Kooky as a theme for our other games. So that's why when we finally sold Dungeon Quest, we had changed the name to Kookie's Quest.
My friend Mark and I also in school were working on a game called Dungeon Quest. So
really, no kidding.
We never finished ours, but
Yeah.
Small world.
I know. Yeah.
And I assume you had an Atari at that age.
Yes. Yeah.
All right.
Certainly did.
Okay.
So hold on, I want to go back. You said Compute bought Kooky Climber, but then they didn't publish it.
Correct.
It's true, yeah.
So, man, that must have been, I assume they paid you, but then didn't publish it. But that must have been super disappointing just because you want to see your name in print and all that.
Yeah.
It was, yeah.
Yeah,
In fact,
I don't know if we ever kind of gave up hope. We kept on, it's not like they told us we're not publishing this. So every issue of Compute that came out, we subscribed. Well, I don't know if we actually subscribed, but we went and bought it every month. But we looked for the game every month, literally, and it just never showed up. But by about within a year of that, I think probably our Antic games were published. So the disappointment didn't last all that long. And they bought it for $400, which to, high school kids was like, we were millionaires, and that was great. And like you said, though, there was a disappointment that we weren't actually published, because I think that game was publishable. I mean, it was as good as anything else out there. It was, you were climbing up the side of a building. It was modeled after Crazy Climber, the arcade game. And it was, fairly polished and, used scrolling techniques and player missile graphics for items that are falling down the building, and your character was a player missile graphic climbing up the building, had multiple levels. Once you got to the top, you started over with a different color building. It was very good. But I don't know. John's got a good story. He thinks he might be responsible for the reason why they may not have been published. And you can go ahead and say that.
All right, let's hear it.
Yeah, so, we had written 2 games that were purchased by Compute. The first one was Kooky Climber. And the second one was a game called Night Rescue, which I actually, personally, is probably my favorite game we wrote. But that second one, we put a lot of effort into. We had been given this $400. We had a lot of chutzpah. We went ahead and wrote a letter asking for more money. And then I think we got the contract, and it came in, and it said $400 again. So we talked, and we agreed, we should call them and press them to get more money. So I did that, but right away the call went south, and it got kind of contentious. And the next thing I know, they're like, "Look, take it or leave it. $400. That's what we pay people." And I'm like, "Okay." I backed off. And then I always wondered, though, because it got so contentious, if they were kind of left sour and just were snubbing us by not publishing.
I could see that.
Yeah, so it was for me, the development of these games was always, there was a lot of learning in it. And that was a lesson, in diplomacy. And of course, later we sold to Antic, and I don't think they even paid as much as Compute. So we were happily taking whatever we could get by that point. So,
But then Compute went and also bought Night Rescue. But
they did.
But didn't publish that either.
In which the take it or leave it offer came.
I see. Oh, when Kooky was still in the queue or whatever.
Probably. Yeah.
So if you remember, was it Antic modes 4 and 5, the multicolor character modes?
Yes, sir.
That had just been discovered. In fact, remember the early Atari 400 and 800 computers came out with the CTIA chip, and then they came out with the GTIA chip. And so there were some extra graphics modes at the end. And I can't remember if the graphics 4 and 5 were extra ones, but we had just discovered those.
Yeah.
And that was the whole foundation for that Night Rescue video game. And it looked great. It was set in World War II. And I remember we had originally put in the flags from World War II in Germany were the Nazi flags. And we thought, well, if this is going to be published, we should probably just use the regular German flag. So we had 2 versions of it for a while, one with the Nazi flag and one with the German flag. But what is on the online database now is the German flag, the modern German flag.
Now that game was a side scroller that encompassed probably 5 or 6 screens worth of scrolling, and your mission was to take a balloon and rescue humans, kind of like you do on Defender or Choplifter. And you go down and you rescue these humans. And we were influenced by all the games of the era. We went to arcades every day, pretty much. That was in the early '80s, So we were influenced by arcade games. So Defenders, rescuing humans, definitely influenced that. But our game wasn't a shoot 'em up. In fact, you couldn't shoot in that game. You just controlled a balloon and you kind of rescued these humans and then scrolled to the right and got to a landing port on the right side. But that game was so well written with no bugs whatsoever because we tested it so much. But it took a long time to test. I remember every time we had to see if we could land or pick up all the humans, we had to play through the whole game, and that took a while to play through. But that was a very good game, as John said, and we should have gotten more money on that one. But John's negotiations.
My hand-eye coordination isn't that good anymore. I tried playing it the other night, and I didn't get too far. So,
but
physics-based modeling for the gravity.
Yeah. It had inertial-based movement. The longer you held the joystick in a direction, the more it would take you to go back in the other direction. It was very difficult, and we had, but that one had all the tricks, with the horizontal scrolling and everything else, and that graphics mode, and it really looked good. It looked like, I don't know if you remember the game Protector from Synapse, but
sure.
And Tale from Beta Lear, it looked like that, but it just wasn't fast. But it was a skill-based game more than anything. But it was really good. I'm surprised it never published it.
I was going to say, it didn't have the nice music of Tale of Beta Lear either.
No, it was lacking.
So when you started to get published by Antic, I'm curious, and also when you got the money from Compute, I'm curious what you did with the money. Did you split it 3 ways? Did your parents take it away and put it away for college, or did you spend it on more gear? What'd you do?
We split it 3 ways, and we bought other things. Like maybe John bought I don't know if you got additional things. We probably got our 800 XL and our disk drive with that money.
Definitely the disk drive.
And we all bought these Atari 1020 plotters, which were really cool devices, 4-color pens, and we all bought those. We bought our MPP 1000C 300 baud modems. So we bought additional Atari equipment primarily, I think, with that money.
That's what I did. I bought some of that, but we also funded at least one trip to Florida with that money.
Yeah. 2 trips to Florida. We funded 2 trips to Florida. We did one right the day after we graduated from high school. We did a 2-week road trip to Florida. And back in those days, there weren't any cell phones or anything. We probably didn't even contact our parents for 2 weeks, away in Florida. And we tent camped around Florida, but still, that funded that trip. We went to Disney World at the time and Epcot Center. And then 2 years later, at Christmas time in our sophomore year of college, we did the same thing. and we went to Key West and Orlando on that trip, and Miami on that trip too. So it funded those 2 vacations to Florida.
Amazing. Nice.
Yes.
Okay, so finally you're starting to get published, and Kookie's Quest happened, and how long was it before you were just like, we're going to do more? We're going to do, I think Robot Dungeon came next, I think.
It was Overflow, actually, next.
Overflow?
So the publishing order was, Kookie's Quest was February of 1985, Overflow was July of 1985, and Robot Dungeon was November of 85. But the order of development wasn't necessarily that order. We had a lot of games going on at the same time, and we had games that we were submitting to all 3 of our favorite magazines, Compute, A.N.A.L.O.G, and Antic, and John's got rejection letters from all 3.
But I do, yeah. I realized I kept a lot of the rejection and acceptance letters, but I also kept some of our original submission write-ups, which I realized I should have read more thoroughly before this talk, because it covers a lot of programming concepts for the Ataris that I've long since forgotten. But actually they're pretty decent. But it looks like we started in 83 and we were like sort of very prolific in 84.
Yeah.
And then, we kind of went our separate ways, and it seems like maybe these guys kept developing a little bit longer than me. And then by I think we got busy with college is what happened. Yes. And, 85 and 86, we kind of tailed off, and maybe we were all still writing a little bit of code, but I can say for myself that, that experience really served me well as any of my college education in terms of development and learning to be a developer. I think the work we did together was really beneficial.
Yeah, teamwork and all that. And we all entered college. We all went to Eastern Michigan University, and we all took the beginner Fortran computer programming class. And we had already, we knew computer programming. It was only BASIC, of course, and some assembly language, but we knew that prior to even our classes. So we all majored in computer science. So that's another thing. And we all went into computer programming. So we did use that definitely to build our careers.
Nice.
And it was all very beneficial. But I think another thing that happened that kind of, we were very prolific, like John said, and we had 3 games published, 2 additional games purchased, and probably 5 or 6 really good games that were either not purchased by these magazines or not even submitted. And those are the ones we recently uploaded to AtariMania.com. Mm-hmm. But the problem also is that right around that time was the video game bubble, and all those magazines kind of disappeared around the 85, 86 kind of thing. So there wasn't, they weren't buying anymore because they had a backlog. I think John got one rejection letter that said, hey, we've got like 20 of these types of games. We don't need any more. So and then that gets kind of discouraging a little bit. And, so that kind of was what kind of wound it all down. The video game bust, college, John getting his own computer and writing his own stuff, and Eric and I continued writing our own stuff. And that's kind of what kind of was the end of it.
Yeah. All right. So we talked about the published and bought ones, and I would like to run down the list of the other ones that you recently released. I'm just going to say the names, and if you have a story or just anything at all, who thought of it, why it was abandoned or whatever. And if you have nothing to say, then we'll just move on. Alien Assault.
Oh, that's a good one.
I want to talk about that. That was one of the most advanced graphic techniques of any BASIC game I've ever seen.
Assailants.
Oh, I'm sorry. We'll get to Space Assailants later.
Alien Assault's even got a better story because none of us remembered it. we had it on our disk. It was a BASIC file on one of our ATR files, which is a disk image that's used in the emulator. So we had this thing on there for the last 20 years, and Eric and I have been running emulators for 20 years, and occasionally we'll run our BASIC games. But this one's been on there, and it just did not run. And we were wondering what in the world was wrong with this thing. So we just never really thought about it too much. But recently, Eric took a look at the source code and realized that we had hard-coded memory addresses in there, and came to the quick realization that hey, this game only worked with a cassette. You know, it overwrote the DOS area of an Atari. So we weren't able to play that for 20 years, and none of us could remember what it was even. And I thought it was something like Space Invaders, but we had another game called Space Assailants that was Space Invaders. So we knew it wasn't really that, but we couldn't remember what it was. But the bottom line is, when Eric said that it was only would run on a cassette, then I used the Atari 800 emulator and created a cassette. No, actually, I used a special version of the Atari 800 that could write a cassette file. I think Atari 800 and Altera only read a cassette file, but I found a special version of Atari 800 that was modified to write a cassette file. So I wrote this cassette file, and lo and behold, it played. And so I shared with them a screenshot of this. This was only a couple of weeks ago. I shared with them the screenshot, and we were all like, I barely remember this game. But it was kind of patterned after Missile Command, where a missile comes down from the sky, and you had to shoot it down with a laser. Now, the difference with this is, though, it was a scrolling game, so you could scroll left and right. And the first thing, when a missile came out of the air, it may not be visible on your screen. So there's a little indicator that said west or east, meaning left or right. And you had to scroll left or right to put this into view, and then you would shoot your laser at it and shoot it down. But then at the same time we had this running in cassette, Eric was determined to get it working on a disc. So he actually rewrote the lines that were hard-coded and, you know, did all the PM base, peak 106 and all that stuff that you need to do to relocate the high memory. And he actually got it running on the disk. And so now we have a complete version, which we call the 2017 version that runs with it. Another thing about that game, too, is it uses what's called parallax scrolling, which is really neat. The foreground images scroll at a faster rate than the background images. And that's similar to Moon Patrol by Williams. And we were obviously influenced by that. We all thought parallax scrolling was really cool. So that game actually uses parallax scrolling in BASICs. It's rough scrolling. It's not smooth scrolling, but it's rough scrolling. But it again is a really good game now that we're playing it. But it hadn't seen the light of day even in our eyes for 20 years. And
we must not have thought it was good enough to publish at that time, though.
Yeah. Or Antic said, "Hey, this is hard coded for cassette."
Right.
It's funny how you all forgot about the one, you know.
That's the only one that
it's been a long time.
Sure.
We remember everyone else, but
a lot of beers have been consumed in the last 30 years.
I hear you. That's Kooky Diver.
Eric?
Okay, I'll tell that one because I basically wrote that one myself. So that one really has an interesting story. I had a dream one night, and this was probably in sophomore year of college or something around 1984, 85. I had a dream for this game of a diver going down to a treasure chest or a series of treasures that were held in a giant clamshell, and had to go down to the bottom of the ocean and grab these treasures and bring them back up to the surface of the water and put them in a boat. And so I had this dream at nighttime. I woke up all enthusiastic and started, we always had this graph paper that we could draw or redefine character sets on, drew it all out and programmed that game in one day. I was completely done from dream to working game in literally one day.
Wow.
And that's a really good game too. I don't know if we ever even tried to sell that one or not, but it's got some pretty nice techniques too. That was the first time I did a vertical blank interrupt, I remember, or a displayless interrupt, one or the other, to change colors, to add additional colors somewhere down at the bottom of the screen. But a lot of these techniques were used mostly by machine language programmers, but we snuck them in assembly language routines within our basic programs. And I probably shouldn't say assembly language because we didn't have an assembly language cartridge. Every one of our assembly language subroutines was hand-coded and all the opcodes figured out by hand. I think I did most of the assembly language stuff, but I remember, just changing opcodes. And if you did a jump and added some extra instructions, it changed everything. You had to change all the other opcodes. So anyway, that one was done primarily by me, but I don't even remember if we submitted that one for publication. But if you got a chance to play it, do so, because it's pretty good.
Yeah, and one thing I remember at the end of that one, most of our games just go back to the start menu at the end of the game, or it just freezes the screen. That one actually kind of kept an attract mode going. So like there's fish and a shark that swim around, and those are your nemesis in the game, and they keep going, and your score flashes. It toggles between your score and like press start. So it's kind of got some neat polishing features to it. I do remember helping a tiny bit on that one. I think I either worked on the shark bit map or the fish or both, and maybe something on it. I mean, I definitely remember pitching in a little bit on that one.
We haven't really talked about Overflow, which was published by Antic. Was that the one that was their disc bonus?
No, that was the July of 1985.
July 85.
Regular. And John wrote that one primarily, I mean, almost all by himself. So John can talk about this.
Yeah, that, I think it was called a bonus game in that magazine. And it was, I don't know, what can I say? I had found display lists kind of interesting and realized some things you could do with them. And it seems like the thing about that game was it was pretty short. And I think even when Antic wrote back, they said everybody was impressed that, you know, such a reasonably good game could be done in such a few lines of code. Mm. And recently, Robert sent me a link to this YouTube video about some 10-line code contest. So I was like, whoa, you know, I know Overflow was still like 30 or 40 lines, you know, and so 10 lines is tough. But basically, what I remember is, so it's like a set of horizontal pipes, and you're a plumber, and you're throwing your plunger down the pipe to try and push the water back. So the water is kind of coming in on either side, and each column, or rather row of water, if you will, is actually the same line of memory. It's just offset differently with like the least significant byte of that row in the display list, I think. So, you know, I had an array of indexers, and I think all it would do is it would flip the sign of that index when you hit it with the plunger. And so they were, you know, those LSBs of the least significant bytes of the display list were kind of initialized randomly to begin with. And then they were just incremented. So you didn't, you know, it was basic. You had a pretty, how can I say, to keep things moving, you had to have a pretty tight main loop. And so that was the point of that. And it was just a simple little, you know, seemed kind of elegant thing to me. And I think it was easy to type in, so it fit the model pretty well.
Nice. Yeah, one thing I want to add to that is that John mentioned the main loop, and you know, all games pretty much have a main loop. It wasn't until like we didn't have any throttling at all on our main loops. We ran everything as like kind of fast as possible. I don't ever remember putting a slowdown or anything in there. So I think we just, I mean, we might have sped things up by like moving things 2 pixels per loop instead of 1 just to speed things up. But I don't ever remember throttling things. And that's one advantage, I think, of having a standard clock speed for all the Ataris. We didn't have to, like on a PC, you'd have to, you know, hey, what if you have a real fast PC versus slow one? You have to have a time loop and all that. Sure. I don't think we ever even worried about time loop. We just looped, you know, and then it just kind of worked. We're lucky, I guess. Some of those games just kind of worked with the loops. Some of them were too slow. I'm sure we had some things where the main loop was just too slow, and we just gave up on the game when we realized that, hey, this just won't work. But that was interesting about that.
Yeah, I guess another thing about that game, you know, speaking of the speed of BASIC, was a challenge, which is, I think, a technique that these guys taught me or found somewhere, was this technique of printing in memory. So you could use the print in BASIC. And, you know, I forget, you had to poke a couple of registers, and then you maybe position 0, and then you print. And it goes where you poke the register to. So that was like a fast way to like write, you know, I don't know, a different shape to your player missile or whatever.
Uh-huh.
And so then I think that was exploited in Overflow also, and maybe some of the other games.
Yeah,
And I was
yeah.
like ecstatic when we found that, because then we could do some things more quickly in BASIC.
One other thing I want to mention too is that since that game was published, we always, with our submittals, we would write a good long set of instructions on how to play it, and then we also would write a good long set of instructions of or documentation of how it was written, like the ticks, the the different tips that we came up with during the game development. But that one, when it was published, we were all kind of shocked. Antic took the liberty to rewrite the instructions to something very like cartoony about, John mentioned it's a plumber's thing, and Antic wrote something about, dear Mrs., something about the maid is responsible for keeping the plumbing from overflowing.
I did not appreciate that at the time, because it was like I thought the article we wrote was a lot better. It described a little bit about the code. But now reading it, 30 years later, it kind of made me laugh. It was like it said it's particularly bad if your guests, eat the pate and it doesn't agree with them or something, and I think I appreciate the humor a little more now, that the sting of them not using my, our prose is gone at this point.
Right.
Anyway.
Excellent. Yeah, I was going to mention the 10-line contest to you guys. If you seem to be getting back into Atari stuff, that 10-line contest, participating in that is usually one of the highlights of my retro computing programming life. I enter it every year and I have a great time. It's
awesome. It's yeah, we were so impressed by that Centipede, and there was a Space Invaders last year. I mean, it was unbelievable for 10 lines of code.
Yeah, the Centipede was me and a buddy. That was
really.
Oh, really?
There were two centipedes. Weren't there two centipedes?
Yes. Yeah.
They were both.
There was one with the. He wanted to do a different version that with the bigger. There's one with small segments and one where the centipedes are bigger, and he did the bigger version, pretty much all him, and the one that was smaller.
I didn't want to insult you, but I thought that smaller one was better. So, that smaller one was unbelievable. That's the first one I shared with these guys. I said, "You won't believe the centipede." So congratulations for writing that. It's
Yeah, very nice.
Thank you. Piracy 2. Were you guys pirates? Just
yes.
You guys copying games as well as making them?
Yes.
Actually not so much while we were writing the games. I mean, that did come later, though.
It came later when we met some friends in college that all had disk drives and happy disk drives, and they had all their bulletin board passwords that got them into these sites. Then we found the area. It was funny. Eric and I were today looking at some of your other interviews, and like Glenn the 5200 man, it was amazing hearing that one. That was great. And there was a pirate. I think his name was Ron the Pirate or something like that. That was a great episode too, because that reminded me a lot of our later years with the Atari. But starting out, we were squeaky clean. We just had a cassette player, and we bought all the games and cartridges and everything else, and didn't get into pirating until a couple years later when we got into college. But yes, I have to admit we did some of that, but we also bought a ton of games as well, and then a lot of the games we typed in from BASIC. But Piracy 2. So that game was written primarily by Eric and I think it was either our senior year of college or it was quite a bit after the other ones. I'm not sure we ever even tried to submit that either, but that was a pretty advanced game for BASIC. It actually used two-dimensional fine scrolling, believe it or not, as the main, and so the object of the game is you're navigating a pirate ship around the open seas, and there's about 5 islands that you have to go find, and the screen is about 5 Atari screens by 5 Atari screens wide, and you can scroll all over the place there. And Eric wrote the assembly language scrolling routines for that just to make it possible in BASIC. Then once you land on one of these islands with your ship, then you go into 2 mini games. The first mini game is it changes from that scrolling thing to a 1-page screen that or a one screen wide screen where you're a ship at the bottom of the screen shooting up at a pirate while cannonballs are being shot down at you. So it's a little bit, I guess, kind of like Space Invaders or something like that, you might say. And then once you defeat, and there's a pirate jumping around randomly at the top of his ship and you're trying to shoot him. Once you shoot him, then you go back to that scrolling area and you have to navigate your ship back to an island. And then you get into a screen where you have to navigate through a moving maze of pirates to get to the pirate's treasure. And these guys are jumping all around, and you got to kind of memorize the pattern to navigate through them. And that game is really advanced. I think most of our games we tried to write to fit in a 16K cassette, 24K disc kind of thing. This one actually used, since the scrolling memory was so big, it used like 32K cassette and 48K disc or something like that. It was huge. It was a lot of graphics memory, but also those two sub games within the game. So it was pretty advanced. But again, at that time, I don't think the magazines were publishing anymore. So we kind of just wrote it to ourselves. It's possible we submitted it, but I doubt it. So Eric and I, and I'm sure we shared it with John, we've been the only ones that have ever seen that game for the last forever until we just recently released that. And hopefully somebody will take a chance to look at that game because it had, just look at the basic listing. It's pretty impressive. And the game itself is pretty fun.
I think the Piracy actually came from like a concept we had, in our prolific years. I think we talked about writing a game called Piracy. And I think when these guys finally wrote it, they just called it Piracy 2 because it was different than the original concept. That's my theory anyway.
Right. We can't exactly remember what Piracy 1 was, but it's something like that. It was a game idea. So when we finally tackled it, it was Piracy 2. Yeah.
Nice. Sokoban.
Eric.
Okay, so yeah, I wrote that one all by myself. And I wrote that one actually after I started working. And so that must have been somewhere around 1988 or 89. And this game Sokoban had come out on a PC, the early PCs, CGA monitors and all that. And it was a very good game. And a few of us at work during our lunch breaks would play this Sokoban, and we could almost do it as a group effort because it wasn't reliant on moving your hands really quick or moving the joystick fast. It was puzzle solving. And if you haven't played that game, it's all about a puzzle to stack boxes within like a warehouse setting in the right order. And usually there's only one real solution to do it. And it probably had over 50 levels or around 50 levels. And at work, we did all of them. And then I quickly realized that would be a very simple game to implement on the Atari computer as long as I stored the mazes in separate data files. So there were 50 some odd screens that were stored in data files for that one, but it lent itself well being in an ATR format. So that one was actually published to the Atari forum many, many years ago. And so I know that some people have actually seen it. But other than playing a little bit slow, I wish it would go a little bit faster. It actually worked pretty well. It wasn't very advanced graphics or anything. I think it was graphics 1 was the mode, and it was redefined characters. And so pretty straightforward programming, but that was the very, very last game that any of us ever programmed. Probably the last time I touched my real Atari computer. And it's just because I wanted to do a game after seeing it at work, more to just see if I could still do it. But never attempted to sell that one, but immediately published it online because even back then, I think there was the forum that allowed us to publish it.
Usenet. I'm sure we pushed it to, or you pushed it to CompSys, Atari 8-bit or whatever. We were on the Usenet forums, and maybe that's where it was released. I can't remember exactly how you got it in the community, but it's there.
Yep.
I was going to ask if you guys ever considered publishing to Atari Program Exchange, but they stopped in winter '83, so I think you just missed that window.
Right. Well, the problem with that is that those were all assembly language programs. No.
They had a lot of BASIC too.
I didn't remember a lot of BASIC with them. We followed it. We loved Caverns of Mars, for example, and we were following Atari Program Exchange, and we knew all about it, but we didn't think our games being in BASIC were really appropriate for that. That's one regret I think that I have is that if we had the gameplay that was pretty good in all these games, but the initialization in BASIC just always took a minute, and it just really made it. And then the BASIC games had a connotation of, hey, I'm not buying that. So if we had written these games in assembly and had them published or submitted to some of these big game publishers, I think the gameplay would have probably been okay in some of these games, but I wish we would have done that. But we just never really learned. We never even had an assembly cartridge, like Eric said. So we really didn't have that possibility of doing it.
These days, BASIC programmers, like some of them, like me, use Turbo Basic XL, which is an enhanced version. And it's a little faster, but it also has like memory moving commands. So if you need to copy the character set into RAM, it just happens instantly. So there's none of that. Please wait. So you can still get all the benefits of BASIC plus speed for things like that.
Some BASIC compilers came out in the late 80s for the Atari, and I think we used those for a couple of the games and tried to speed them up. We don't have any of the resulting executable files, but I think we looked at that.
Yahtzee.
Okay, so that was a game I wrote, I remember, in my senior year of college. So that was 1986 or 1987, depending on which semester it was. And it was just to write a game of Yahtzee. The only thing that was unique about that one was the die themselves used a technique of, John kind of alluded to, printing to memory. This was an understanding that using some of the Atari BASIC string manipulation commands could really speed up movement of memory. So the die were done all with one big player missile graphic, but with all the manipulation of the die and the dynamic writing of the die themselves was done using string manipulations of the same exact area of memory as the player missile graphic was stored. In fact, in Ataris, you point to where the player missile graphic memory is, and that pointed just to where the location of that string was. So a little bit of an advanced technique, but nothing really notable, and I definitely didn't try and sell that one. I think that one ended up on the Atari forums too, though, a long time ago. I probably uploaded.
Literally graphics 0 with control characters for graphics. So yeah, it wasn't. Yeah. It didn't look all that great, but it played fun.
And finally, I think Space Assailants.
That's the one I was thinking of before, but John came up with this awesome technique, and you got to tell that story. I've never seen it done before in BASIC.
John, tell him what you did on line 240 that was so
I think they're giving me a hard time right now because I haven't really looked at these guys. Like a week ago or less, send me this thing. We're gonna do a write-up, a memoir of the old game programming days. And I said, yeah, I'm kind of busy. I'll get to it at the end of the week. And my end of the week, I'm thinking Thursday, Friday. Well, like Wednesday, they send me the thing. Oh yeah, we're gonna have a podcast. I'm like, what? I haven't looked at this in 30 years. So last night I did some digging in my basement. I actually was pretty happy that I found this box that still had the listings and things. But Space Assailants, yeah, it was again, I was messing with display lists, and it's Space Invaders ripoff, basically. And it uses like two separate display lists, and somehow I'm jumping back and forth between the two display lists. So that there's a star field in one, which is scrolling, and then there's the aliens kind of walking back and forth in the other one in two different graphics modes, but they're interleaved. And I guess it's a kind of a cool game unless you have epilepsy, because it kind of flickers quite a bit. And that was actually, I forget, they said we submitted it, I think it was to A.N.A.L.O.G, and they wrote back, and they're the ones who said, oh, we have like 2 years worth of space shooters. But they said, and also it flickers like crazy. So that was the other thing. But I looked at it in the emulator, and it didn't seem so bad to me, actually. So.
Yeah. The emulator might be smoothing things out a little bit.
Yeah, it could be. Yeah, right.
When I took the screenshots of that for that article, it's like funny. It's like half of them came up with the star field and half the screenshots came up with the
Yeah, okay.
at the same time. And I tried to take a picture with a camera and I still only got one of the. So
that makes sense because when the screen capture happens, it's
right.
like probably during vertical blank or something.
Right.
So let me fill in something on that one. That at that time, I was the one that was starting to do some assembly language subroutines, and I had done a joystick in the vertical blank, capturing the joystick motion and setting the horizontal position of the player accordingly so that the ship at the bottom of some of our games was very smooth, just like an assembly language, because it was assembly language. So John said, hey, can you do the ship at the bottom of the Space Invader? John wrote most of that game, but he asked me to do the ship in the bottom in assembly language. And I remember doing it, and I couldn't get it to work for the life of me. I probably worked at least a couple of days trying to figure this out. And then I realized that whatever John did, the technique he was using to interleave these two graphics modes disabled the ability to have a vertical blank. I don't know what register it was, but there's some hardware register on the Atari computer that to do this technique, you had to actually disable the ability to read a vertical blank routine. So that's why that never worked. So the ship movement isn't quite as smooth as it once was, but that one is another example of printing to memory. On both sides of the screen, it says Space Assailants. It's made up of a player, a long player, because Atari players can be the whole length of the screen long. And John just printed to the player memory at that point to print out Space Assailants without a lot of fancy code involved at all. And in fact, that was nice because the Space Invaders moving back and forth, it was real easy to detect when one of them hit one of the players. If there was a collision, just send them back the other way. But I played that the other day and actually made it through the 6 levels. And I thought, the initial Atari Space Invaders wasn't the greatest game I've ever seen. And this one seemed to rival it to me. And it used that graphics Antic mode 4 as well with multicolor Space Invaders. They looked really nice.
That's a good looking game. Yeah. Nice. So I'm curious sorry, go ahead.
One more thing. So it's Robot Dungeon, which was probably one of our best games ever, which was the disc edition game.
Okay.
November of 1985. Okay. That game, started out as the actual rooms in that game are actually a maze that you get from the lower left corner of a 20 by 20 maze to the upper right corner of a 20 by 20 maze. But the strange thing about this maze is it was a hexagonal maze. And I'll let John talk about this because he developed the maze, or he borrowed the maze algorithm. But go ahead, John.
Yeah, so back in high school, these guys talked about Creative Computing magazine. And, that was actually probably one of the first as algorithms I was even aware of as an algorithm was this maze generation algorithm that came out of Creative Computing. And it was an article, and it turns out, because I Googled it and I was able to find the thing, from the June 1981 Creative Computing called Be Amazed. And, it's out there, thank goodness for archive.org, because you can find scans of Creative Computing from the 80s.
That a lot, and thank you for doing that.
Yeah, and so I lucked out with Google and I found the article, but that was kind of a nice algorithm for generating mazes, and I think we got a little carried away because we were able to very efficiently store these mazes in memory. We wanted to make the biggest mazes we could make for that game. And I think these guys have pointed out that we made these levels so big that no one would ever even finish them.
And the disappointing thing about that is they were 20 by 20 and there were 3 levels. So there's 400 levels on each level, or 400 rooms on each level. And there's 3 levels. That's 1,200 rooms. And at the end of each level, we actually programmed in great cutscenes of animated robots. So Eric was able to come up with if anyone's listening to this and cares, line 675, if you put RN equals 1200, you're in the final room and you can jump right to the cutscene, which is amazing, great cutscene that we recently looked at. And the only reason why we even remembered this cutscene we were re-looking at the instructions that came on this disk that we had actually written, but Antic wrote this. They inserted a couple lines of code at the beginning of this game that called the help file. We had written the help file as instructions that were meant to be printed in the magazine, but since they published it as a disk, they converted this into a text file, our instructions, and then wrote like 3 or 4 lines of code that called this instruction from the disk drive. Because at the very beginning of that game, it says, do you want instructions, yes or no? That Antic actually added those lines of code and called up our instructions. But part of those instructions says, at the end of each level, there's a cutscene. And both Eric and I were like, well, what cutscene? I can't remember that. And then when we looked at it and we cheated and got to the last screen by changing that line of code, those cutscenes were great, and the game itself is great. It's kind of based on Venture, Exidy's Venture, an arcade game, and also kind of based on Atari's Adventure, and also kind of based on, there were a few commercial games that were similar to that too, like Berserk, and but the game was great. You came into each room and you had to shoot 5 different robots that were converging on you, and there were treasures in the rooms, and each different treasure had point values, or there was a super zapper that killed all of the robots, or there was one of those things that sent you back to the very beginning of the level as a mean thing if you accidentally touched it. But like John mentioned, I doubt anyone ever finished that game but us, and it's unfortunate. So Eric rewrote it, a 2017 exclusive version that we just released, that you can enter your size of maze. There's a dungeon creator that goes along with it, and you can enter any size maze from 5x5 up to 20x20. So the 5x5 maze is manageable. And Eric actually added a cheat that says, do you want to walk through walls? So if you just want to walk up and finish the game quickly, you can cheat and do all that. But that's a very good game, and it was released on a disc version. And the funny thing I remember about that is that we had submitted the game, and I guess we got paid for it. And it was just like those compute games where we never saw it published. And then I really think it was just a small little corner of the page that says disc bonus robot dungeon. We didn't subscribe to the disc bonus of Antic. So luckily we saw that, or else we would have never even known it was published. But we saw that little ad that says, look for our disc bonus. And we realized that it was published in that. But we had never seen the disc bonus because we'd never gotten the disc. But recently I did download the whole disc because somebody was nice enough to publish all that, and realized that they had changed it a little bit, like with that help at the beginning. But we've got the old versions that don't have that. So that's kind of interesting. One other quick anecdote now that we're done with all the games. We really pushed the memory limit. We wanted the games to run on a 16K cassette. And almost all of our games literally use, all the available memory, which on the Atari BASIC was like 12.864. I can't remember the exact number, but we used the exact number of bytes. We couldn't add one rim statement, a remark at all. And we had no comments in these games whatsoever. And at the very end, we used this program that we found that would rename variables, and we wanted to stick all of our initials in there. So we renamed like meaningful variables to J, W, E, A, and R, A, and so we made the code completely unreadable, which was way more. That made it more amazing that Eric was able to actually update 2 of these games recently.
Wow. Yeah, it came back to bite me 30 years later. But the other thing is, there was a technique of saving memory that every number in BASIC took up 6 bytes as a floating point number, but a variable only took up, once you had introduced it, only took up 1 byte as a token. So a lot of people use the technique to use the code like 0 equals the number 0. And we took it to extreme, putting our initials and even friends' initials in there. And it really did make it completely unreadable. The only thing that was nice is we had a program that was published in one of those 3 magazines that would renumber your code. So at the very end, all of our lines of code went up by 10. It'd be line 10, 20, no, 100, 200, 300, whatever. So the numbering looked nice, but the code looked terrible.
So, all right, I assume that you know, went to college, you went on to other things, you got better computers. So what prompted you to release all this stuff and write up this long document and release all this stuff in the public domain? What prompted you to do that now?
Well, I think
I had nothing to do with it.
yeah, John did about 2 days ago. Well, recently, Eric and I both, since we're twins, we got this mental thing. We both recently independently downloaded this Atari Best game package that has like 1,000 of the best games.
Mm-hmm.
We had collections of a lot of these games, but this one's really nicely organized, and it comes bundled with 2 emulators, the Atari 800 emulator and Altera. And Eric and I really hadn't used Altera too much. And so we started using, that's a great emulator, by the way, you know, it's, you know, clock cycle perfect. So Eric and I started looking at that. And of course we loaded our old games, which we do, you know, once a year or something to see our old friends. But while we did that, Eric was the one that discovered that this Alien Assault never ran, and he decided to fix it. And then I said, look, I'm going to publish these things. And Eric came up with the idea. He said, why don't we film you and I playing these games and talking about them, kind of like this blog, but, you know, filmed for the family only, just to kind of document it. Because Eric said, you know, 20 years from now, people might not even know how to load these games. People aren't going to know where to find them. So let's get them on video. And so I said, well, I'll write an article about it. And so I wrote this article, you know, and I got carried away and wrote more and more, and you know, wrote about the background of how we developed these games, and then wrote about each individual game, and then included the source code and screenshots and all this stuff, and you know, share it with Eric and John, and we all thought it was great. And I said, you know what, these games really do deserve to be immortalized somewhere, not for our own ego, but you know. Yeah, it was for our own ego, probably. But you know, we wanted to get them out there. Why, you know, I guess 3 of them had been out there. 2 of them deserved to be out there that were bought but never published. So and then we got the one working again. So we just decided to do this all in one fell swoop. And that was just within the last couple weeks. But, you know, it started out by just taking a look at this Altera emulator and running our games again. And one other thing, too, is that you know, we really didn't have a break, I would say, from the Atari. We went straight from developing all the way up until 88, 89 to still playing the games. It was still hooked up to our TV through like the early 90s. Then the emulators came out, and I bought the PCX Former when it first came out in the early 90s. And so we had that, and then I got this SiO2 PC that transferred our games to the PC, and I could run them with the emulator. And then the emulators got better, and Eric and I actually are part of the MAME development team as well. So we've been involved in emulators from the very beginning. And there's another long story to that too. I wrote an emulator in the late 90s that merged in with MAME within the first month of MAME's existence. So I'm one of the first MAME developers, and I'm still on the listserv, and I'm still considered a MAME developer. I think Eric's email address changed, so he dropped out. But Eric and I both have written games for MAME as well. And so we were into emulators all these years from the late 90s when they became popular, and always ran our games with emulators. And then, so like I said, we've never really taken a break from it. And you know, every year or so, you know, we take a look, like I said, at our old friends, play some of our old games again, and play some of the commercial games that we really liked, like, you know, Star Raiders and Seamus and, you know, Galactic Chase, which was one of our first games we ever bought, and Defender, and some of those great games for the Atari 800. And then, you know, we'll always crank up our own basic games too to see if they still hold up. And, you know, again, that's kind of how it all happened. It was just kind of time for them to be released.
Nice. Do you guys have, any of you have actual Ataris, or is you all emulation?
We still have them. They're in the attic, though. I think I was just telling Eric, so John had his, do you still have your computer, John? I'm not sure if you do.
I think I gave it to one of you guys in the 90s. Is that possible?
No, I don't think that's possible.
I don't have it, no, but...
You know, it is possible that if you said,
check in your attic, I think you might have 2.
Throw this away or take it, we took it, I'm sure. I don't know if that's the case, but I think I've got the 400 and the 800 XL and the 410 and the 1050 up in the attic right now, and probably a few discs and cassette tapes as well. But I haven't looked at that in 10 or 15 years. But so we really have exclusively used. I had it set up until about the early 90s, and then the emulators came, and then we copied the files we needed to the PC, and we never really went back to the real hardware. And then, of course, at that time, it was, when HD TVs came out, it was harder to hook these things up to them and that kind of. But now this resurgence of excitement has me wanting to go up this weekend to see if I can find them and get them hooked up to. Yeah, I might have to buy an adapter or two, but I
right, yeah.
hook up again, because what I'm really curious seeing if there are any games that we still have on disc that weren't part of that release. And there's a possibility, but I doubt it, because we would have copied them when we had a chance to years ago with that SIO2 PC. But I'm going to look.
I think what you guys have done is amazing, and you obviously did it with so much love, and you wrote up 30 odd pages with screenshots and descriptions and memories, and then you found the original documents and added, and it's beautiful, this little document you've made, and good job, and thank you. And yet I want more. I would really would encourage you. I think John, you might have said you have the original letters that you wrote to the magazines and the contracts and the letters you got back from them. You should scan that too, and just make a pile of that and put that out there.
Yeah.
We're encouraging them to do that. That'll be in version 2.0 of the document. I'll put all that in there for sure.
Well,
yeah.
We definitely have all the original bitmap drawings. Wherever the boxes with the Atari 400, we didn't throw those out.
Oh, yeah.
You got like every bitmap drawing for the character sets and everything. We didn't throw it away.
Nice.
Yep.
Yeah, design documents. That's exciting. Nice.
Right.
Cool. Well, anyway, I encourage.
Design documents would put a little bit too much. We kind of programmed by the seat of our pants.
Yeah.
There's no design.
I think a guy who has a dream and makes a program within 24 hours can say that
we did not have a printer. Thinking back at those days, you could not print it out and look at the whole listing. You had to scroll through the screen and it was all in our heads. Now that was back. There's always the old saying that back then, one person wrote everything, the graphics, the sound, the game design. We did all that, but we worked as a team, but we didn't have it like one person was the game, the graphics, and one person was the sound. We just all kind of chipped in.
Sure.
So, but yeah, we did it all without printers and without a disk drive for the most part. So that, and with a membrane keyboard. So that, yeah.
Most of it was done with the three of us sitting right next to each other, one person kind of driving, at the controls, but all three of us seeing every single line that was typed in and collaborating. It was
absolutely.
We took turns of the keyboard. It wasn't like one person typed the whole thing. It was, we were all doing things that, hey, you design some characters while I'll be typing in some logic, and yeah, it just worked. we really got along great, and those were some good times. And, some of those sessions ended up late at night. I mean, a lot of them did. And that was part of the fun, too.
Oh, yeah. Like my mother yelling upstairs about dinner time. It's like 5. And, she just gave up because we would go and not take a break.
I think that we learned, and we all wrote software for many years after that. We were developers, and I think we've all done a little bit of managing of development also. And I think that one thing about this experience of working together on these games, it's very multidisciplinary, and it's all about collaboration. And it really, I think it gives you a strength for this type of career when you have that kind of background. And, of course, the fact that you're doing something you love, writing these games when we love to play the games and we love to see how we can make these things be fun, just made it easy to do that.
Nice. So briefly, what do each of you do today, either professionally or hobby or just whatever?
So
Okay.
I am a supervisor of a QA group at a company called Phoenix Contact. We do hardware primarily for automation. So they also make a lot of little green electrical connectors, but we do IPCs and we do PLCs, programmable logic controllers. And I am, doing that here in Ann Arbor, close to where I grew up.
Nice. And Eric?
So in September, it'll be 30 years working for the Department of Defense doing training software for the Navy. So flight simulators for the Navy pilots, things like that. The Center of Simulation for the military is in Orlando, Florida, and that's where I've been for the last 30 years.
Fun.
Yep. And I'm in the same industry, but Eric works for the government and I work for a contractor, General Dynamics, a defense contractor. So I manage now a computer-based training group that puts together computer-based training for primarily the Army. So Eric and I have been in the modeling and simulation industry here in Orlando since we graduated from college in 1987.
Nice. And it all started with simulating space aliens attacking the Earth on the Atari.
For sure. Yeah.
Right.
All right, last question, I think. If you could send a message to the Atari 8-bit community, and you can right now, what would you tell them?
Well, wow. I would say I'm so impressed that this community keeps going and going. I think, I want to give a shout out to the teams in Poland that really pushed the envelope on what the Atari could do over the years. Those demos that, Eric and I have been watching and over the years have been incredible. And they kept, I think Eastern Europe kept the machine going until like the late 90s. And then, emulators kind of took over. But I'd say to the community, I love the enthusiasm. I was really shocked that so many people have downloaded these games we've already published and read this article about it. So people are interested. The emulators are great. I love reading the Altera hardware reference notes that talk about the real low-level programming of the Atari. But great games keep coming out. It's amazing. Part of me says, like, come on, guys, graduate to some like modern hardware. But on the other hand, it's so neat to be able to program a machine that you really feel like you can control with, 64K of memory and a limited instruction set. You really feel like you can master that computer, and I think that's what keeps the enthusiasm going up. It's now it's kind of like PCs are a huge thing to program. I mean, it's like you're not touching the clock cycles anymore at all on a PC. So anyway, but I say to the community, I love the enthusiasm, and I still like to be part of the community. So I've never dropped away from it. So I'm still part of it and keep going.
Yeah, and I guess what I would say is I really, again, emphasize I really appreciate the emulator. I mean, I haven't been as involved with it as these guys, but over the years they've, helped me, get some emulators going, and they sent me this recent emulator, and I was able to bring it right up. It works great. It's got a nice user interface, and it really allowed me to, go back and look at these games from my past. And, as Robert said, I don't know, it just takes, it took a little, like a different kind of finesse to get a good experience on this hardware. So that's kind of a neat thing to me. I appreciate the finesse, like the 10-line code thing, It takes a little finesse to make something that's playable and enjoyable in so little, with the limited resources and at your disposal, and still it can be fun based on playability.
Good answer. Eric?
Okay, so from my perspective, so I moved from software development to management myself, And I had such a bias for the early years of being a supervisor, thinking that if you didn't program or didn't teach yourself to program, you're probably not a very good programmer. And I think everyone in the Atari community probably taught themselves how to program at one point or another. You don't move into it from somewhere else. You probably start out with the Atari. So I really think that the experiences that we had gave us a great foundation for careers. And again, the tricks that we learned and the oneness with the hardware and all the sharing of the community back in the early days with the early magazines, Antic, A.N.A.L.O.G, and Compute, really helped grow the community. But like Robert said, I'm blown away by what the modern programmers are doing on the Atari computer, especially those wonderful programmers from Poland. So keep up the good work. Yeah. And we really appreciate it. So you've definitely taken it far beyond what we could ever envision. But it's nice to have some recognition and remembrance of some of the early programming days of the Atari as well.
Like I mentioned, we submitted what's called new old stock. You know, it's new to everyone else, but it's old stuff from the glory days. You know, so we recognize that it's nothing compared to the modern stuff that's being done with the Atari, but it's how it was back then, and those games kind of represent the times of the 80s when we put them together.
Oh, good work. Great, I have what I need. Thank you all so much.
Thanks,
right.
Kevin.
Yeah, thank you, Kevin.
Kevin, we really like your podcast. Honestly, that was one area of the Atari that I wasn't familiar with. So Eric and I both have a list already of like 10 we got to get to right away and listen to all these. So we really thank you for, I know you've been doing it for several years. Thank you for keep on coming up with these great interviews. I mean, these guys that were like gods to us, all kinds of great guys from Atari, from Nolan Bushnell to Elkhorn, and then just all these, companies that Datasoft, DataMost, Sierra Online, all these companies that those were the great companies of the 80s and you somehow managed to track all these people down. It's amazing to interview all these guys. It's really neat listening to them now, especially Glenn the 5200 man that Eric and I really enjoyed listening to today. That was really good.
That was awesome.
Good. I tell you, that one was, I'm still surprised that I got to talk to him. It was just because it was incredible for me too.
You do talk to him. Personal thanks for bringing Vanguard to light, because that was one of our favorite games. And that was like one of the first 5200 ports that I remember seeing from him, and I thought, oh my God, this is awesome. Why didn't Atari release this for the 800?
Yeah, I know. And it was like, what's this plus the pound or star button? It's like when we first saw these games. And then, do you remember there were like 2 different versions of Centipede, and I think the 5200 was way better. And it's really this, but anyway, yeah, that was a great interview. And the guy remembered a lot of like the memory addresses and stuff. It was like, it's incredible that he remembered like exactly how he moved the stuff in memory to work and stuff. But anyway, you've done a great job of tracking these people down and capturing their memories. So thank you. And we might just be inspired to enter that 10-line contest.
You should try it. It's fun. It's hard. I like it.
We got to get Basic XL or what's the basic?
Turbo Basic XL.
Turbo Basic XL. Yeah. Okay, that gives you a little bit of an advantage over Atari Basic, but still, those games are incredible. Your Centipede was awesome. Thank you.
Thank you. All right,
guys.
All right. Okay, great. All right, thanks for arranging this. We enjoyed it.
All right, good night, all.
All right, bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.